just a few minutes late tonight, but we are back on Cosi Talks Live. It's been a little bit of a break I've taken the past couple weeks. So for those of you who are watching the replay, go ahead and let me know that you're watching the replay. Just type replay in the comments section. I do like to go back and see who is watching the replay. And also, if you have any questions, I do look back to read the questions and try to answer them as well. So I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes to jump on board. I understand my text message reminder, unfortunately, for some reason, did not go out this evening, even though I sent it. I'm going to have to kind of look into that and see what's going on. But in the meantime, we are going to just start this evening off with a toast. So cheers to everybody who's listening so far. And I see some of you popping on board this evening. Hey, Harsh, how are you? Thank you for being here. All right, guys, those of you who've been with me for a while, you know my spiel, and let me know who you are, where you're from, and what is in your coffee mug or glass this evening. Hey, Tom, thank you very much. It's nice to be back. I've missed doing this show. So, guys, those of you who are out there, don't be shy. Also, guys, tonight I have a couple of questions that were submitted to me that I was able to grab off my emails, but not as many as I usually have. So feel free to go ahead and start posting any of your questions that you may have into the comment section as well. All right, I see the numbers ticking up, so we're going to give you guys another minute or so to get on board, and then we are going to go ahead and get started. We've got Theo on board from Albuquerque, New York. Rudy, I'm sorry, I keep calling you Theo Rue because that's what your handle says. Hey, Chuck, there with your iced tea on a cold, snowy and Wyoming evening. Oh my goodness. Yes, I think you guys are having some pretty wickedly cold weather. Hey there, Kim. Thank you for joining us this evening, guys. All right, I see some folks going on board. And just a reminder, folks, I am available also on my YouTube channel. So I know that some folks have a little trouble finding me on Facebook, and the YouTube channel is sometimes a little bit easier to find me, and it's under Cosi Talks as well. I have this big, huge bow sitting here. I need to just move that out of the way. All right. Hey there, Mark S. Yes, the hair is finally getting long again. Hey there, Denise from North Carolina. There's my Tar Heel. She's got her water bottle and multitasking, watching her Tar Heels. All right, there we go. We got Brian there with his Bustelo. There we go. We got Hilita. Thank you. Oh, love you too, Mom. I love you too. Line, comadre. It's so good to see you guys. Yeah, I've missed doing this show. It's funny, guys. I've been doing this show for 5 years, and I can count the number of times on one hand that I didn't do the show on a Wednesday night for 5 years. That's a pretty good record, right? So these past 2 weeks, it's been a little bit of a void in my life not doing the show. Hey there, Phil. Oh, thank you for joining in, Phil, from Canada. We've got Johnny V in the house from Poughkeepsie, New York. All right, guys. So we've got a nice crew on board. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Hey, we got Fred the sock guy. Oh, I like that. I like that. Thanks for joining in. So, guys, not a whole lot of questions were submitted that I was able to grab this week, and I'll explain why in just a moment. So go ahead and feel free to start posting your questions now in the comments section. Rhonda from Colombia with water in her drink. All right, guys. So for those of you joining me for the first time this evening, welcome. My name is Cosi Belloso. I'm a physical therapist, amputee specialist here in Tampa, Florida. I've been a PT now for over 20 years. I can now finally say a little over 20 years. So I do have an outpatient practice here in Tampa that is exclusively for working with amputees and teaching them how to get ready for a prosthesis, how to walk with a prosthesis, and even sometimes how to run with a prosthesis, which I love. Hey, compadre from Miami Beach. Thanks for listening in, man. So, some of you noticed I was out for 2 weeks, and I had to cancel the show for 2 weeks. And I just wanted to say it was we had a passing in the family. My father passed away a couple of weeks ago. He had a very long illness, and my mother and I were caring for him for quite some time. So I took the last 2 weeks off to lay him to rest and to be with my family during that time. And I really appreciate the support that many of you have sent me, very kind messages and prayers. And I truly, truly appreciate that. So for those of you who've watched my show, you've heard me reference my father and my mother on several occasions. I had the most amazing parents. So raise your glasses tonight, guys, and cheers to Jose Gonzalez. All right, we've got Chuck is excited for tonight's show. We've got Charlie coming in from New York. Thank you guys. We've got Pastor David. I am so glad to be back. All right, guys. So, as you can imagine, I've been a little bit behind with answering my emails. I just started back at work again on Monday. So, if you did send me a question, and I haven't answered you, nudge me and send it to me again. Trust me, I don't mind. Okay. So, and also start plugging in your questions into the comment section right now, and help me get this show on the roll. Thank you guys. You guys are wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, this first question that came in was from Marianne. And she says, here I am with another question. I love Marianne's questions. I always love her questions. She says, my short leg is getting really hard to get my pin lock socket on. I think it's becoming slightly contracted at the hip because I have to keep trying to get the pin lock up closer to the top of my leg versus on the end of it. What can I do for that? I wear my legs a lot and I'm not sure if that's what's happening or not. Okay, so just a little bit of background so you guys can kind of get a mental image. Marianne is a bilateral above the knee amputee. So she is missing both the legs above the knee, right? So those of you who are above the knee amputees, whether single or bilateral, you know that one of your biggest obstacles can sometimes be hip flexor tightness. So what is hip flexor tightness? I always like to explain things in case somebody is listening in for the first time. All right, we've got some big, beefy, juicy muscles at the front of our hip, and it helps flex our hip, bringing our knee up, right? And some of these muscles attach to the inside part of the pelvis here. Bob is kind of shy. He's hiding his head right now, but he's going to be our model, right? So they attach here, they start here, and then they attach somewhere in this area right there. So it's kind of even though it's a very wide muscle, it's not a very long muscle, right? So when you lose the weight of the bottom part of your leg, that big, powerful muscle wants to continuously bring the hip up, right? And you get tightness. And sometimes that can lead to a contracture, meaning that you're losing the range of motion and you're not able to extend the hip fully. And that can become a big problem when it comes to using a prosthesis. You need to have good range of motion at your hip so that your hip flexors and your glute muscles and everything can work properly to give you a good, strong, powerful gait, right? So when you, oh, thank you guys. These messages are so sweet. Thank you. When you go see your prosthetist, when you go see your physical therapist, one of the things that we will be doing is we're going to be screening for hip flexor tightness. And this is something that can either present right away, especially if the person did not have physical therapy in the hospital to teach them how to prevent this from happening. It can happen later on down the line, right? So it very well be that Marianne is noticing. So she has a pin lock. So that means she has a pin at the end of her liner that goes into the hole in her socket, right? That's how her socket is connected to her leg. And she's noticing that the position of the pin is changing, right? That's actually kind of rather astute of her to notice that the position of the pin indicates that she very well may have hip flexor tightness. Now, first thing I'm going to tell Marianne is go ahead and take your liner off and make sure that you're putting it on the wrong way. Because sometimes with these liners, especially the ones with pins on them, if you don't put it on in just the right spot, right? If you rotate it a little too much, a couple of degrees, or what, y'all know what I'm talking about. Y'all who have the pin lock liners, you know what I'm talking about. It's not going to fit in properly, and the fit is just not going to feel right within the socket, right? Okay, so when you're doing that, if you suspect that you have a hip flexor tightness, I'm going to show you an exercise that you can do. And then I'm going to tell you how you can tell if you have a hip flexor tightness. I'm going to show you the videos. So, guys, really quick, I'm going to put this on here. Hang on. So, you guys can follow along if you like. Sorry, I don't type very fast one handed. So, guys, I'm going to go ahead and share. I'm going to go ahead and share my website. So on my Strong Body website, I have 150 exercise videos that are designed for above the knee and below the knee amputees. So I'm going to show you the stretching exercise that I like to do with my above the knee and my below the knee patients for the hip flexors. Okay. Adult beverage in hand. Cheers, Paul. Cheers. All right, guys. I'm going to go ahead and share this. Okay. So there it is. There's the program. Those of you who have this program, you can find this under the flexibility. If you're in above the knee, you go here, below the knee, you go here, and you scroll down to the flexibility portion. And you're going to see a lot of nice flexibility exercises here for yourself. The hip stretch supine. So there's two ways of stretching out the hip flex that I like to do. There's the one where it's prone, right? Where the person is lying on their belly. And a lot of people are familiar with this one. But the one I really like to do is this one. So I'm going to let it play for you guys.
So probably the number one culprit when it comes to being tight in a particular area for an amputee is the hip flexor area. That's the front part of your hip. You've got a lot of big, strong muscles here that help move your residual limb up and down, and they can get particularly tight. So there's two ways of stretching out this hip flexor muscle that I like to use. With this one, you can do this on your bed, and I'm going to have Robin scoot to the edge of the bed so that the residual limb is hanging off the edge. So you got to scoot over just a little bit more, and just be careful with this one, folks, okay? Now for this one, all you're going to do is you're going to let gravity take effect. So she's going to allow her residual limb to hang off the side of the bed. And as you can see, she does have a little bit of tightness. But this is a really great way just to kind of slowly let this stretch down and out. Sometimes folks like to keep their prosthesis on while they're doing this exercise because of the weight of the prosthesis can help bring down this particular side of the hip. You can also bring this knee up and bend your foot up just to take the stress off your back and also help with the balance. So with the stretching, I just recommend starting with 10 seconds, letting it hang for 10 seconds, and then bringing it back up onto the bed just to rest, and then bringing it back down. If your lower back is hurting during this exercise, you can put a little towel roll under your back, or you can also just adjust your foot to take the pressure off your back. Give it a try.
Okay, so can y'all give me a thumbs up if you heard that? I always get a little bit squidgy with the share screen option on this program, and I never know if the sound is going through along with the video. So if you guys were able to see that video, okay, can you guys give me like a thumbs up or something like that in the comment section so I know, yes, you were able to see it. Thank you, Brian. Okay, so Rudy says I'm a left above the knee with pin lock, short residual limb. I'm having the same issues. Okay, thank you guys. Oh, good, good. Yes. All right. See, I'm finally getting the hang of this technology. Woohoo. Steven says I had a bad contracture from having a broken pelvis. My PT guy, Steve, stretched me out for months and completely got rid of the contraction. Guys, contracture, excuse me. Yeah, it can take a long time. And again, this is something that, as you know, when I worked with patients, basically coming out of the OR from their amputation, that was one of the first things we jumped on, is making sure that we would position their leg in a way in the bed that would not start to promote that contracture from happening. And again, this is one of those lifelong pursuits. You gotta stretch it and keep it limber, or it will contract, even for those of you who are seasoned amputee veterans, okay? So the reason why I like the one lying supine on your back is because a lot of people cannot tolerate lying on their belly for a long period of time. Some people can, and that's wonderful because you can really get a nice stretch with your hip flexors. But I also like this lying supine because I feel like you can control it a little bit better, and you're not putting as much stress on the lower back. You're actually stretching the muscle that is intended to be stretched. And this particular muscle, by the way, it's called the psoas major. Just a weird, funny sounding muscle. Okay. So interestingly enough, guys, if you're thinking to yourself, well, how do I know if I have hip flexor tightness, right? So if you notice the position that Robin, my model, my beautiful model, was in, right, where she had her leg down and she bent up her sound limb, that's how we test for hip flexor tightness. It's called the Thomas test, right? So if you're just thinking, okay, do I really have hip flexor? Lie yourself on your back on your bed, right? Bring your sound limb up to your chest as far as you can go, and then just let your residual limb down onto the bed. Now, if your limb does not naturally lie on the bed, that means you've got a contracture, you've got some tightness going on. Or if you're really having to kind of push your residual limb down into the bed and you feel like a stretch here in the front part of your hip or a little tightness there, again, that's your indication there that you have some hip flexor tightness, okay? The other reason I like doing the stretch in that particular position is sometimes I'll even put a warm pack on my patients after they're done with their workouts. And I do my stretching, guys. I tend to do the stretching after the workouts when the muscles are all nice and warm and juicy and all the circulation's flowing in there, and it just makes it easier to stretch out those muscles, right? So I do like to put a warm pack on there and then just kind of let the leg hang just a little bit with gravity with the prosthesis on. Okay. Now, this form of stretching is called static stretching, meaning you're just basically letting gravity do the job. Or in the case, for example, of Rudy, or not Rudy, who was the other gentleman who said, Stephen, right? Sorry, I keep clicking the wrong buttons. Steven, he said that his physical therapist went in there and stretched out his hip for him. That's still considered to be a static stretch. Okay. The other side of it is called the dynamic stretch. And the more I work with the amputee population, the more I also like to use dynamic stretching. Okay. Because I feel like you can really get an effective stretch using body weight. So what's dynamic stretching? Basically, it means that you are stretching the muscle with movement, right? That you're not still, that there's not gravity just taking the stretch for you, that it's not some crazy PT cranking on your leg doing that stretch for you. Okay. So some examples of dynamic stretching that I like to do with my patients, having a person walk backwards, which sounds kind of crazy, but yes, I have every single one of my amputees walk backwards. And when they get really good at it, I have them walk backwards in tandem, meaning one foot directly behind the other. Just think of like the drunk walk test that they do. Okay. So when you're doing that, if you kind of think of the mechanics, when you're walking backwards, you're bringing your leg back, right? Bringing that leg back and stretching that front, right? A little more goes into it because you got to make sure you got the right foot placement, that you're not arching with your back, that you got to, but that's a really great example of dynamic stretching. And I find I have a lot of success with that with my hip flexor tightness patients. Now, my below the knee patients, you're not off the hook completely. Okay. You're not going to be as prone to having hip flexor contractures, but you're still at risk for hip flexor tightness. Okay. So, in that same program that I just showed you, I have the below the knee version for it. And those of you who have ordered the book, I know a lot of you love using the book. For my below the knee folks, it's on page 121. So, you can see that same. It's basically the same kind of a stretch for the below the knee as it is for the above the knee. And for those of you who have my above the knee book, it's on page 109. Okay. So I know I have had a lot of questions come in with regards to the program. So for every video that you see in that program, there's a corresponding book entry that gives the pictures and the description of the exercise itself. Okay. So I said that because, like I said, I had a lot of comments that did come in this week about that. Speaking of which, a gal by the name of Jenny said that she purchased the book and that she's going to take it to her physical therapist session. Okay, guys, that's how I wrote this book. That's how I wrote this program. Okay, I want you to take it to your physical therapist. Trust me, your physical therapist is going to give you a thumbs up and say thank you. Okay, for two reasons. There's many PTs out there that don't have specialized experience working with amputees. But if they just look at the book, with the knowledge that they have of being a physical therapist, they're going to be able to start putting a plan of care together for you. And for the physical therapists who do have amputee experience, at the moment, there really aren't any resources for us as professionals to be able to download programs, to download pictures, all those things that you normally would get from your physical therapist. They really don't exist very much for amputees. So this is a wonderful resource for them to use as well. Okay, let's see what else we got in here going on. And then I do want to say this about stretching, guys. So in Steven's case, he said he had a bad contracture from a broken pelvis and his PT worked him for months. And yes, guys, when it comes to tightness and contractures, okay, you do need to be careful because there is the potential to actually hurt yourself. And here's what I mean. So for example, the psoas muscle, right, that big juicy hip flexor muscle that I talked about, it connects right here to the inner part of your pelvic bone, but it also attaches to the lower vertebrae in your spine, the lumbar vertebrae. It has a lot of origin, a lot of places, a lot of attachments here. So if you get too aggressive, you're actually going to start pulling on the muscle from your lower back. Okay. And you can see where that can be the potential to cause some problems. So if you feel like your hip flexor is something that's a little bit more complicated than just doing a simple stretch at night after you've had your leg on for a while, this is the time to call your physical therapist where they can assess and take a look at your tightness and contracture and say, yeah, you got a big one going on. We need you to come in so that we can work this out little by little so we don't cause you an injury. Or, nope, you just have a simple case of tightness. Stick to these stretching exercises on your own and you'll be good to go. Thumbs up. All right, let's see. Hey, we got Eric listening to me on the YouTube channel. Wonderful. Okay. All good, all good, all good. Ah, thank you, Paul. So, guys, I got to give a shout out to Paul. Paul is the reason I'm the ornery PT that I am today. So, he has the dubious honor of saying that he was one of the two PTs who were instrumental in training me as a clinician from the early years. And I will never be able to thank him enough for that. So, what Paul is saying is sometimes, Paul, you're throwing me for a loop here because now I got to find the words. And this is something that I'm not very good at explaining, but I'm going to try my best. Okay. You have for every muscle group, you have an opposing muscle group, right? Yin to yang balances out, right? So you have biceps, and directly behind it, you have the triceps. Your biceps is in charge of bending your elbow. Your triceps is in charge of extending or straightening out your elbow. So all the muscle groups in your body have that little buddy system going on, right? So with your hip flexors, that's in charge of flexing, right, your joint. Then the hip extensors, right? There's quite a few of them. The biggest one is the gluteus, is in charge of extending your joint. So it kind of works in opposition, right? So sometimes in our stretching techniques that we do, we might ask our patients to actually activate the opposing muscle, right? So if you think about it, right, if we're trying to stretch out our hip, right, and trying to get it to straighten out more, if we use the glute muscle to help straighten it out, it just gives it a little bit more of a kick, right? And there's different strategies that we can use, like contract, relax, hold, relax, all these fun techniques that physical therapists use to kind of trick the muscles into relaxing a little bit more and stretching out even better. It's kind of cool, actually. Okay. And again, when we're using dynamic stretching, we're also taking advantage of some of these opposite muscle groups to help stretch out these areas. How'd I do, Paul? So Rudy says, I am about 12 degrees on my residual limb. Okay, so 12 degrees, let me see if I can demonstrate what that means. Come here, Bob. All right, so what that means is that instead of being able to lay flat like this, Rudy's leg is just ever so slightly up. Now, 12 degrees doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when it comes to using a prosthesis, anything over 10 degrees can present with a little bit of a problem. Okay. But Rudy, have no fear. There's a lot of solutions here for this problem. Okay. Usually, when sometimes something like this happens where there is a bigger hip flexion contracture, something that's more than 5 to 10 degrees, depending on the prosthetist, right? They'll put in what's called a hip flexion plate, right? And it kind of looks a little funny. Like it looks like the socket just isn't aligned quite right when you look at it. And it's because it's trying to accommodate for that hip flexion contracture or tightness. Okay. And this allows the person to use a little bit more of their range of motion. Okay. Now, what I learned over the years, especially after I opened up my own practice, is I would have my patients come to me, and in doing the physical therapy and doing a lot of this dynamic stretching along with static stretching, my patients could eventually have the hip flexion plate removed by their prosthetist. Okay. So if you're somebody, let's just do a quick Cosi poll. How many of you, I don't know if you know it or not, but how many of you have a hip flexion plate? How many of you did your prosthetist say, I got to put this thing in here to help accommodate for your hip flexion tightness? How many of you, let's just see a show of hands there. How many of you have that hip flexion plate? It'll be interesting to see. Okay. So again, with the hip flexion plate, whenever I have a patient who comes in with a hip flexion plate, I'm actually more aware to test them every so often and reevaluate, because if they are making improvements with their hip flexor tightness, I want that hip flexion plate to slowly get weaned off, right? Because I want them to start utilizing that newly found range of motion. Does that make sense, guys? So if you do have a hip flexion plate, make sure you tell your physical therapist. They may not know what that is, okay? Or they may not have identified it as being a hip flexion plate. Again, if they don't have the experience working with amputees, and explain it to them. Just say a hip flexion plate is to accommodate for my hip flexor tightness, right? Okay. And Rudy, I've worked with patients with more than 12 degrees of contraction and tightness, and we've gotten some really good results. So again, this is something I want you to take back to your physical therapist. Mhm. Okay, Drew, that is a wonderful question. Thank you for feeding me that question. What problems does hip contracture cause when using a prosthetic device? Okay, so when it comes to using a prosthesis, you need to be able to extend your hip back. Okay, let me see if I can. I know this is like a tiny little screen. Let me see if I can show this. Right, so when you're taking a step, right, you take a step here and notice what's going on here. You see how I'm straightening this part out and my leg is trailing behind, right? So if I have hip flexion tightness, right, my leg is not able to stretch all the way out back. Okay, which means I'm not going to be able to really get a good power and move forward, right? So everything is compromised. I'm not able to use my glutes well. I'm not able to use any of this. So that becomes a huge problem. You're taking a shorter step and it throws off the dynamics of the leg, right? So that's probably the biggest one that I see is you're not able to extend back. Along with it, I'm going to try to stand up again, see if I can make this work, right? So if your hip is back here, right, your movement starts from this hip bone, this front hip bone right here. Okay, it's called the ASIS, right? And it starts to do a little bit of a rotation, right? It's very tiny movement. I'm exaggerating it right now so that you can see it, right? But it's a little tiny rotation that your body does. When you have that hip flexor tightness, you lose the ability to move and do the rotation that you need to do up here as well, right? It's kind of one of those things. Yeah. Hey, Liz, thank you for joining in. Ah, thank you, Paul. See? I remember the stuff you taught me. Yes, so the socket has to be made, and let me see if I actually don't have a hip flexion. Hang on. Pull for my toys over here. I don't have a socket that's been fit with a hip flexion plate. That's actually something I should probably try to get if I can. But basically, it's a little plate that goes on this part of the prosthesis. So it goes here, right? And it looks just like that. It looks like a little metal rectangular plate, and they can adjust it accordingly depending on how much of a contracture that you have, right? So if you notice that, like those of you who are my above the knee amputees, right? That between your socket and your knee joint, there's like a little plate that's like sticking out. That's probably a hip flexion plate. Just ask your prosthetist, they'll tell you. Right? Mm. Good question, Pastor David. Can one completely rid themselves from contracture? Yes and no. A lot of it will just depend on how severe a contracture it is and how long it's been there. So if somebody comes to my clinic, right? And I've had folks come into my clinic who are years out of their amputation, years out, and I'll notice that they have hip flexor tightness, and I'll ask them some questions. And, I can tell sometimes by palpating just to see how tight that tendon is, right? Well, maybe not that tendon, but I can just see how much of a tightness there is there. And some of them might be very knowledgeable already and say, yeah, I have hip flexor tightness. I've had it for over 20 years. Not going to go cranking on that. Not going to go cranking on that. And the reason why is because when the tendon becomes tight over the course of time, right, it can undergo changes, right, where the actual tendon itself may be a little bit more calcified. So it may be a permanent contracture. And that's not something I'm going to go cranking on, right, because I'm going to start to injure other parts of the body, right? And I'll try to work around that. That's an extreme case, okay? Usually when it's less than, I'm just throwing out a number here, guys, and I don't have any research in my brain. This is just me and my experience speaking right now. If it's less than 15 degrees, we can usually get it resolved completely. And if it hasn't been going on for a very long time, right? If it's more than 15 degrees, then our goal is to just reduce it as much as we possibly can. And again, it can take months. Stephen just said it right there. His PT was working on him for months. Is it worth it in the end? yes, it's worth it in the end. But again, this is one of those like everybody's a little bit different kind of scenario. So this is why you want to have a physical therapist, a licensed physical therapist, look at you, palpate, see what's going on, and really examine that contracture. Okay. This goes a little bit way beyond your average personal trainer teaching you how to do some stretches after you've worked out. Oh, Phil, I do appreciate you recommending these books. I really do. And guys, those of you who have bought the books and the program and have recommended it to your fellow amputees or your clinicians that are working with you, really appreciate it. Thank you. Mm. Drew says, I am certain I have it now. No PT ever said anything to me. Been to 4 of them. None evaluated it using a cane now as an AK. And Drew, the unfortunate reality is there's not a whole lot of us out there in the United States right now. I'm not sure about other countries, but I think it's also a similar situation. Not a whole lot of us out there that practice working with amputees, right? So with every patient population that you have certain things associated with it, right? And certain things that as a physical therapist, you know to look for, right? So if you're not experienced with working with amputees, hip flexor tightness might not be one of those things on your radar to look for. Now, in my case, whenever I do get a patient that I am not familiar with the diagnosis or the pathology, I do a head to toe evaluation. And that came from my good mentor, Paul, taught me how to do that. Um, I would say that if you've been seen by an orthopedic physical therapist, they should have been screening you for this because that's kind of one of those basic evaluation tools that they're supposed to be using. So Drew, if you like, actually, I'm going to type in my email. And guys, I do apologize. My texting service, like I said, I've been out for 2 weeks. So I'm not sure what's going on with my texting service, but my email is working just fine. Those of you who have questions for me, that's my direct email address. I answer all of my emails myself. So, Drew, what I want you to do is I want you to email me what area you live in the United States, and let's see if we get lucky. And I might know somebody in your area that I can refer you to. So yes, and the fact that you're using a cane again, I don't know much about you, Drew. I don't know your age. I don't know your status. I don't know anything about your health status. But if you feel like getting off the cane is something that is a reasonable goal for you, then yes, a physical therapist with amputee experience is going to be definitely key for this. Let's see what's going on. Sorry, I'm like trying to woohoo. And doubt that your socket was adjusted for it. Drew, it depends. So if you had less than 10 degrees of hip flexion tightness, your prosthetist may opt not to use a hip flexion plate. And actually, guys, I'm going to write this down. I really do need to look up the latest research. I'm writing this down because I'm getting old. And if I don't write it down, it's not going to happen with hip flexion plate. Okay, I'm going based off of what I see in my clinic, what I've worked with over the years, and the prosthetists that I've worked with. And typically, if it's less than 10 degrees, many of the prosthetists will not put in a hip flexion plate. Okay, so Drew, it could be that yes, you can feel the tightness, but it may not have been enough to warrant a plate. The other thing, Drew, is when was last time you went to go see your prosthetist? Because if the hip flexion tightness has been getting worse and you haven't gone to see your prosthetist, might be time to go make that visit and have them check you out, right? And the PT. Thanks, Paul. Oh, thank you, Dulcie. I appreciate that. When do you? Oh, that's an interesting question, Stephen. So Stephen says, when do the other above the knee amputees take the legs off? Because of going to bed with the cleaning of the limb, the liner, I take mine off early evening shower. That's a good question. It also goes hand in hand with the question of the folks like, how long do you wear your leg? Are you someone who wears your leg from morning till night? Are you wearing your leg only when you leave your home? Are you still in the beginning stages and still getting used to wearing your leg? So, Stephen, I know a lot of my patients who are, fully independent with their prosthetic limbs and use them for their entire day. They'll do exactly that they will go and do their evening shower and evening hygiene. And at that point, either maneuver around with crutches or a walker for the rest of their evening because it can be a little bit of pain to keep putting the leg back on and taking it off. So I know that's what I hear, but I'd love to hear everybody else's comments on this one. Marianne says, I used to, and I don't want to go back to that. So you used to wear the hip flexion plates and you don't want to go back to that. And Marianne, I know you work really hard with your physical therapist. So look up those exercises and because I know you have the book. So look up that exercise, have your physical therapist just kind of screen you and just see if your hip flexion tightness has been steady or is it getting a little bit more tight. Mm, yes, that's what that plate on your socket is called. Yes. Um, Liz is like, then I do have the plate and I hate it. Guys, the plate is not the enemy. The plate actually gives you that range of motion. It kind of gives you, what can I say? It positions your leg forward, right? Which ironically enough gives you the ability to move further back and extend your hip back. And I know that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I wish I had a picture so I could just demonstrate to you guys what that means. But in using the hip flexion plate, it allows you to have actually a little bit more range of motion available to you so that you can walk. And then hopefully, with the course of time and good physical therapy, you can get that hip flexion plate removed. Okay. But it's not the enemy. Okay, so thank you, Paul. So he says, remember the difference between tightness and contracture. Loss of motion for a long time usually indicates contracture. Yes, so it's a more permanent situation. And in my mind, I think of tightness, contracture, and permanent contracture. And that's just me and my brain, how I think about it. Because there are folks who've had loss of motion for a longer period of time, but we're still able to kind of work it out or at least improve it a little bit. And some folks who've had the loss of motion, long period of time, and it ain't budging. Okay. Again, extreme cases. Hey, Daniel, thanks for joining in. Yes. And actually, guys, when it comes to this tightness, there can be also, and there usually is, accompanying weakness. Okay. And that's an excellent point that Paul just brought up. So if you think about it, right, if your hip flexor is tight, your glutes are not working efficiently, right? They're not really able to really do their job properly. So that might end up contributing to some glute weakness, right? Or the opposite. Sometimes the glute weakness can lead to hip flexor tightness, right? So chicken egg scenario, right? But the point is, when the physical therapist is evaluating you for hip flexor tightness, they should also be doing a muscle manual. Excuse me, I can't talk tonight. Manual muscle testing to see which of those groups need strengthening. So usually it's a lot of things that are kind of going on leading to that hip flexor tightness, right? It's not just that one thing, right? Ha ha, Paul. Nice try. You still don't know how old I am. All right, and we're gonna leave it there. Let's see. Rudy says it's been 20 months since my amputation. I just started physical therapy in January of 2023 with my prosthetic leg. So, Rudy, this is something again your physical therapist should be addressing and looking at and evaluating. Let's see. Phil says, thanks for everything. I best get my supine stretches going double time. Left above the knee and just had right foot surgery. Whew. Go fix foot from an old accident the first time I tried losing a leg. Oh, dear. Okay. Um, Daniel asks, is there specific exercises for a below the knee that's had the fibula removed? Okay. So just a little quick anatomy lesson. So if you're a below the knee amputee, Daniel, okay, and you had the fibula, that's that little tiny bone. Honestly, if I had a below the knee come in who is missing their fibula, there wouldn't be really much of a difference in the exercises I give them. The fibula actually only takes 10% of the weight when you're walking, when you have two anatomical legs, it only takes 10% of the weight there. So it's actually kind of just hanging around, really not doing a whole lot. You got some muscles that might attach to it, and that's about it. So no, Daniel, there's no specific exercises for that. I would be using the same exercises for below the knees who do have their fibula. Wow. So Paul says, we both knew a hip disarticulation patient who wore his prosthetic to work and took it off at home and used forearm crutches. I say, wow, guys, because hip disarticulation requires a lot of energy expenditure to use a prosthesis. And those of you who are my above the knees, you're going, yep, we get that too, right? So the higher up the level of amputation, right, the more energy that you have to expend having to power a prosthetic device, right? So it can be exhausting. And I know I'm preaching to the choir right now when I say this. It can be absolutely exhausting to use a prosthetic device for a full day, the higher up you go. Okay. So when I hear about a hip disarticulation who's able to go a full day with their prosthesis and then be able to walk around at home with forearm crutches, I'm like, hats off, hats off. Liz says it's ruining my seat cushion. Oh, Liz, then Liz, you need to start doing the hip stretching exercise that I just pointed out. Okay. I think you bought the book, Liz, so it's in there. Look in the flexibility section, right? It's in the back of the book. Woo, Phil, you're going to be laid up for just a little bit then, huh? All right, let's see. Hang on. I'm scrolling through. Drew says, I'm waiting for a new socket to be built. I emailed you about finding a PT. Good. Volume issues are killing me. Cannot use a socket for more than 6 weeks until it gets too loose or falls off. 1.5 years since amputation. Hope to get a new one in 4 weeks. Ooh, you just touched upon one of my favorite subjects. And I can see all my old viewers going, oh boy, here we go. Right? So, Drew, very, very common. And it's probably, yes, one of the most frustrating things that I hear from my patients is the volume fluctuation that happens. And I'm pushing it back up to 2 years after amputation, up to 2 years. And you're kind of grazing that mark. You're at the 1.5 year mark. Okay. And usually what I've seen is the more active the individual, the more dramatic, right? The limb will shrink. Okay, because they're active and they're pushing the fluid out of the limb. Okay. So obviously, this can present a lot of problems when having to wear a socket because you're either having to take your leg on and off several times a day to adjust the fit of your socket, or you're having to go back to your prosthetist every, I don't know how many weeks to get fit for a new socket and then battle insurance to approve the new socket and all that kind of fun stuff, right? So, allow me to introduce the adjustable socket. This is the RevoFit system. It's made by Click Medical. And yes, they are one of my sponsors for the show. They were my sponsors for the show last year and also this year as well. There are different options out there, guys. We are starting to see more options for adjustable socket technology. This happens to be one of my preferred adjustable socket solutions. I like the fact that it has several different options. So if you can see here, this is a model socket, by the way, guys. So this has a lot of action going on it. This is not how it typically looks. They just made me a socket with all the options so that I could demonstrate. So you have something that's called a gap design, and you can see little cords right here. You have something that's called a panel. So let me just make sure I get the right dial on there. Right. So with the panel design, right, it can come out and then you click the dial, and it tightens back in. Same thing with this one. So you have the gap there so you can loosen it up, right? You can see the strings getting loose. You click the little dial and it tightens it up. Okay. So this is something that your prosthetist can order. So the way it works is your prosthetist makes the socket, right? They make the socket the way they always make your socket. And then they order, I've got the wrong box here. They order from Click Medical and they'll get a little box like this and it has all the equipment that they need to build the adjustability into your socket, right? So for people who talk to me about volume, okay, this is a socket I like to recommend that they talk to their prosthetist about. Okay, so Drew, I'm going to write that name down. Okay, look up their website. They've got a lot of great resources on there. Feel free to email me and I can send you some more information about it. Okay, sorry, I've got these emails coming in. I got to get them out of the screen. Okay, so for me, it's just really easy. I believe it adjusts, and I always forget the number, guys. It adjusts up to 10 ply sock, right? So you can basically adjust it and just push the button out. You don't have to take the leg on and off several times throughout the day, and it can buy you. I know it's getting to the end of my night when I can't speak straight. It can buy you just a little bit more time before having to get fit for a new socket. Okay, you have a contact at Click. Then Drew, I would say give them a call, talk to your prosthetist and see if this is an option for you, right? I know I have a lot of RevoFit users here that are very happy customers. um, okay, where to get the book? All right, Sean, here we go. I'm going to show you. Okay. So I went ahead and put the link below for the book if you would like to order the book. And also, that's the same link that if you want to subscribe to the program and you can get access to all 150 videos, like the one that I just showed you. Okay, so there you go, Sean. Drew says, I have an adjustable socket. Which kind of adjustable socket do you have, Drew? Marianne says, Medicare hates new sockets. Yes. Yes. All right, so a lot of you like your RevoFit, which is great. So Chuck had it on his below the knee, and now he has it on his AK. Cuts way down on the time of needing a new socket. Yeah, it's kind of a game changer for a lot of my folks. Okay, I think I've gone through all the questions, guys. Let me just make sure. Ooh, here was the last question by Steven. And he asks, I was looking, should the liner be trimmed above or below the socket trim line or over the trim lines? My prosthetist said something about trimming my liner about an inch or more the whole way around a new liner. We are starting to cut it next week. Okay, so when it comes to your liners, guys, you want the liner to extend a little bit above your socket, right? Part of the liner's job is to kind of protect your skin, keep things cushioned, right? Provide an interface between your skin and the socket. So if you cut the liner below the trim lines, right, you're going to run the risk of having irritation to your skin from the trim lines itself. Okay. And it also can interfere with the actual fit of the socket because everything, when your prosthetist fits you for your new socket, typically they do it with the liner in mind, right? So they cast it and do everything, the ones that I know of, with the liner on. Okay. So some of you, obviously, these liners can sometimes extend well past what they need, especially for my below the knee amputees. It just gets way up too high and you trim it down. I always recommend, guys, unless you're like a super experienced amputee and you know what you're doing and you've been there, done that, gotten the t-shirt, have your prosthetist do the trimming because obviously once you cut something, you can't put it back together again. And these liners can get really, really pricey. So usually what I see prosthetists do, and every once in a while, I might take a pair of scissors to a liner, but I'm very, very cautious about it. I just trim a little bit at a time, just a little bit, and just bring it down as low as I can without compromising the fit, without allowing it to go underneath. Usually I like to see a liner, right, that goes that much above the end of the socket just because it kind of just keeps everything nice and sealed in that system. So that's just my personal way of doing it. If I have any prosthetists on board that would like to chime in, feel free. But that's kind of it. You don't want it to go below. You don't want it to go below the trim lines. Okay. Oh, my pleasure, Stephen. All right, guys. I think I answered all the questions this evening. Again, those of you who sent me questions these past 2 weeks, if I have not answered you, please send me the questions again. Don't be shy about elbow me in the ribs and saying, Cosi, you didn't answer my question. Or if I missed your question tonight, I'm going to put my email down one more time for those of you who joined in a little bit later. Okay. There we go. So there you go. You have it there. And thank you guys again for all of your kind words this evening and your support. Truly appreciate it. Thank you very much, guys. So coming up, let me just give you a sneak peek as to what is coming up. February 22nd. Mark this, put it on your phone alarm. Okay. February 22nd, I am going to have Integrum on the show. That's going to be my first sponsored show for the year. So I'm excited for this to be happening. Integrum are the makers of the Oprah system. It is a type of bone anchored prosthesis. It uses osseointegration to allow a person to walk without having to use a socket. Okay, so we're going to go into the opposite end of the spectrum on February 22nd. Now, this was a company I had on the show back in 2019 when they first started appearing in the United States. And we're going to have them back with all the updated research and their progress that they've been making with a lot of our US patients. So I'm really, really excited for this because this is something that many of you have been asking me about. This is something that I feel like you need to have a really credible source to get this information because this is a pretty serious procedure here. And we're going to have some amazing special guests this year that are going to tell us their story with osseointegration. So February 22nd. And even if this is not something that you're like, yeah, there's no way I'd ever do osseointegration, it's always good to just learn and know what's going on around you, right? And learn what's out there and, just have that information. All right, guys. So as always, thank you for letting me be a part of your lives this evening. I will see you next week, same bat time, same bad channel. God bless.